the topic that is going to be discussed in the class is going to be animal testing and why it should be minimized. The speaker has credibility because she wants her career in the pharmaceutical research, and then she has information about it, and also she has information about this topic, and she works in the lab with mice, and thus she wants to talk about how much extent the mice should be used in the lab. She also has a dog, so she has special connection with the animals, and she wants to talk about how much the animals should be tested. Also, yeah, I had a test yesterday, and I totally feel that animal testing should be minimized. Sorry, that was a bad joke. But that being said, I would like to introduce Bianca Tomaszewski.
You got it.
If I would like to welcome her on the stage.
Okay, so every year there's around 100 million animals that are killed due to testing. And this testing can range from like cosmetic testing, pharmaceutical testing, or anything along this sort of range. So, but as research becomes more and more of like a prominent part of our society, more and more animals are being used for tests. And a lot of times these tests can be very inconclusive, so they just waste a lot of time, money, and sometimes they're very inhumane. So it's just kind of like the whole idea of animal testing is something that should be minimized and is something that really is sort of arbitrary. And as technology grows, there's different ways that different tests that can be used that will sort of avoid this. And as you guys know, like Raj said, my name is Bianca, and I really want to go into pharmaceutical research. So animal testing is going to be something that is going to be like a very prominent part of my life, and I'll be seeing a lot of. And I currently work in a lab right now that has to do with a lot of testing on mice. So I see like how many are killed, I see like all of their like toes getting chopped off and their ears, just to see like what sort of genes they have and stuff like that. And I also have a dog that I've had my whole life, he's very dear to me. So just thinking about like all of the animals getting tested is like sort of traumatizing and hard to think about. So hopefully by the end of this speech you guys will realize like to the extent in which animals are used in testing and how it can be minimized, and then why animals are used and how there are certain laws to protect them, but they aren't necessarily doing the best job, and then what other sort of tests that can be used instead of doing animal testing. So as everyone knows, animals are used in like cosmetic research, pharmaceutical research, but there's actually a lot of other different uses that animals are used for. And one of those areas is medical education. There's around 20 million animals that are used in medical education, and then more than half of these are killed just to use for dissection. And the other half that are used are performed, some sort of tests are performed on them, and then this can be obviously really traumatizing to the animal and usually ends up in some sort of death anyways. And there's different options that can be used instead of like dissecting or testing on animals. And these can be like computer programs, and then different sort of like human stimulations and things like that. And one study actually found that students studying pharmacology actually responded better to computer programs than testing on animals. So for animals that are being tested for medical research, this can be very traumatizing for the animal, and as I talked about before, these animals are used in preclinical trials before they're tested on humans. So the toxicity is unknown, and the only tests that have been given up this far, or that have been given this far, is how like an enzyme or a substance will react in glass. So you don't really know how it's going to react in the human body or in an animal body as a whole. So really you have no idea how it's going to react. So the toxicity is unknown, and this can be really deadly because you're going into a study kind of blind and you're not sure what's going to happen. So a lot of times thousands of animals are killed because you have no idea what's going to happen. And this is not only just a waste of time, money, and resources, but it's also very traumatizing. And not only are mice used, I know like a lot of people just think, oh, it's just a mouse, like not really a big deal, but in many cases there are a lot of different animals used. So it's not just killing like a rodent, it's killing like dogs or horses or primates too. So like I said, animal testing is kind of inconclusive. Different species are going to react differently to different substances. For example, if you give a pregnant cat aspirin, the kittens that they have are likely to have birth defects. But obviously we can take aspirin and that doesn't happen to us. So testing on an animal doesn't necessarily give you the sort of information that you need to get a drug passed and see what sort of effects that it's going to have on a human. And this is due to the different metabolisms. Like obviously everything is very different, like a human body is very different than a dog's body, things like that. Everything is broken down in different ways, so it's hard to test how like a human body will react based on the information that's given from like how a dog body reacted. And for example, dogs have like very sensitive livers and ours are like a little bit stronger, so if something's very sensitive on a dog, doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be harmful for us, so it's just really hard to tell. And so obviously this can waste billions of dollars because you can get all this information and think, oh, this drug might work really well, and then you test it on a human and it doesn't really work at all. So not only are you just like killing animals for no reason, you're wasting a lot of time, money, and resources as well. So, and then these tests can be obviously very inhumane. There are some companies that really don't care and will test any sort of toxin. It could be like cosmetic, it could be like a household item, anything along those lines. If they're given enough money, they just like are inhumane and will not really take into consideration the feelings that the animals have. And there are very like few laws that are set in place based on like housing and type of testing. Housing can be very unsanitary. A lot of times animals are kept in like small cages by themselves, which can not only have like mental effects on them, but obviously physical effects as well. And then a lot of times they are given like tubes down their throats and nostrils that will they'll be force-fed different drugs, and they have no way of like kind of restraining and like not taking it. So this can be obviously very traumatizing to them. And in addition, there are no painkillers required for any sort of testing. So animals can be like shocked, burned, or like go into some sort of surgery, and then they'll be given no sort of painkiller. So they're just experiencing a lot of pain for research that may not actually have an answer. So it's just kind of inhumane. And then one example of this is the case that actually launched PETA, and one of the founders actually went undercover at the Institute of Behavioral Research, and what he found was that there were 17 monkeys living in unsanitary cages. They were all separated, they were all wired like the picture kind of shows, and there had been like bodily fluids that had accumulated for like years. So it was just a really gross environment and obviously not healthy for them. And the research that was going on there was they were surgically severing surgically severing nerves to paralyze one of their limbs, and then they would restrain the monkeys and shock them until they regained use of their limbs. And like sometimes this took up to hours, which they would just continually be shocked over and over again until their limb would work again. And this was obviously very painful and traumatizing for the monkeys, and some of them were so traumatized that they actually started ripping off their own skin. So instead of using animal testing, there's a lot of different tests that can be used, and one of the main points that scientists say is that, well, if you don't test on animals, you're going to have to test on humans. But human testing is already done. Like animal testing is preclinical just to make sure you can move on to the clinical trials, which is testing on humans. So it's pretty much pointless to say that if you don't test on animals, you're going to test on humans because you're already doing it. And like I said before, animal testing is very inconclusive. The information that you get from it doesn't necessarily tell you how a drug is going to work in the human body. And then a lot of scientists say, in addition, that in vitro testing isn't very useful when it comes to testing a drug because it's just in glass and you can't really see how like an enzyme is going to react to a different substance if it's not in the body. Because there's like different ways that the drug is going to be broken down. Your metabolism might react to it differently in your body than obviously it's going to react in glass. But in vitro testing is actually advancing, and there's this new sort of technology that's called organs on chips, which is basically, it sort of simulates like an organ system on a microchip, and it has like different organ cells and organ tissues that can sort of replicate how a drug is going to react like in the human body. So this can be used instead of animal testing, or can be used prior to animal testing, just to make sure that it's not too toxic and it's not going to be extremely harmful. And then in addition, there's in silico testing, which is basically using like computer programming, and these are becoming more and more advanced. Like as there's more research done on like the human body and how different like processes work in the body, these can be updated, and these can actually predict how drugs are going to work in the human body. So they actually can prevent animal testing as a whole, and they've as more testing is like being done, they're found to be very accurate, and they can actually predict like how things are going to work in the human body much better than actually testing on an animal. And there are human patient stimulators, which would replace dissections in medical schools, and these are basically like fake human bodies, and they have like, they respire, they have like circulating blood through them, or like fake blood, and they actually have a full like organ system. So you can try and see like how that would, so you can see like how you can dissect that instead of an animal, and you would get like a much better feel for like how it would be in a human body rather than actually dissecting an animal, and it won't give you as great of information. So, and then finally, there are laws that protect animals, but they're not necessarily doing the best job. So AWA, which stands for Animal Welfare Approved, only protects 10% of animals that are used in labs. And basically the animals that they're protecting are like dogs, cats, and primates. And although these are used in labs, they aren't really used as extensively as other animals. Most animals that are used in labs are mice. So like I said, it excludes mice, and it also excludes rats, fish, birds, and reptiles. And this law sets very limited standards for like housing and protection, and it doesn't really take into the psychological needs that certain animals have. Like for example, chimpanzees like have to be very social and like can't really be isolated, and it doesn't really take that into account because there are still animals that are being like isolated and treated very poorly. And there are so many institutes that like use animal testing that there aren't enough investigators to go around and make sure that everything is up to code. And even if it is, it's really easy to ignore, and not everything gets reported. So even though there are laws, it's not really doing that good of a job to protect these animals. Okay, so I have a little bit of a review. So why can animal testing be inconclusive? Anyone?
React differently than humans.
Yep. And then what other sort of tests can be done?
In vitro.
Yep. And then there's in silico, human simulators, and then there's also human volunteers. And then what % of animals does AWA protect? Yep. So in conclusion, animal testing is obviously something that is very prominent and very hard to avoid, but there are different sort of tests that can be done to ensure that like animals are being used less, and even though like there are some cases where like it can't be avoided necessarily, there should be different laws that like protect them and make sure that the animals aren't being that physically harmed. And also, it's like very hard to avoid certain products that are being tested on animals, especially if you're using any medication, because that's obviously part of the process of it getting approved. But there are a lot of different cosmetic industries that like refuse to test on animals, so using those products can actually minimize the harm that these animals feel. So, any questions?